Hello, welcome to Ecotactics Conversation series on environmental research practices hosted by Generation, focusing on exploratory methodologies for fieldwork, ecopedagogy, and environmental literacy. This program weaves together a network of practitioners who've been experimenting with novel approaches for ecological research, crossing the fields of arts and sound anthropology, media studies, hydrofeminism, and pedagogical activism. Past sessions included anthropologist of sound Stephen Felds and architect Godofredo Pereira. And for today's session, I have invited Melody Ju, who is an associate professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara, working across the fields of ocean humanities, science fiction, science studies, and media theory. Melody Ju is a scuba diver and author of Wild Blue Media, Thinking Through Seawater with Duke University Press, which won the 2020 Speculative Fiction and Cultures of Science Book Award. And she's co-editor with Rafika Ruiz of Saturation, and Elemental Politics with Duke Press. She's a widely published author, and her new work explores the mediations of seaweeds in trans-Pacific contexts. I'm very pleased to have Melody here with us and to share this space to talk about her practice and research, her experimental methodologies. It's really great to cross oceans and have the chance to talk. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today and for the generous introduction. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started by sharing my screen. And here we go. All right, so I've tried to keep this as conversational as possible, and I love the heuristic of eco-tactics, so I've tried to focus today's conversation and discussion on scuba diving as a type of eco-tactic. Okay, so to share a little bit of my research journey, I came to the ocean after a great deal of sort of journeys into other things. I'm originally from California, and much like Portugal, our proximity to the ocean is very close. And originally in my studies, I had pursued the science fiction and sort of become disenchanted with the project I was working on as a graduate student. So it wasn't until I was watching David Attenborough's narration of the BBC series Blue Planet, which considers global oceans and the life forms that live there, that I realized, this could work with my existing interests and allow me to turn back to something that I really loved. So in this series, Attenborough talks about how there have been more people in outer space than those who have been to the very bottom of the ocean. And furthermore, the ocean is full of alien sea creatures with strange, seemingly to us, strange habits. And so between these two characterizations, I started listening for the way that the ocean was described as alien, which Stefan Helmrich does so well in his book on Alien Ocean. And I began to also look at who else is writing about the ocean and the humanities and the arts, and what do some of these interventions look like. So at the time, I was also taking a course on theories of space and place, and none of our readings were oceanic. All of them were terrestrial. So I started looking around for work that turned more to the ocean, and also work that tried to look at the ocean through non-terrestrial lenses and frameworks. So I really like the sort of cheekiness of this map that inverts the color scheme of a typical geographic expanse, making the continents themselves the blank blue of different shades, and instead illustrates the oceans in multiple shades of colors to illustrate where different trenches are. And this illustration is by Santa Dalloway. I mentioned Alien Ocean earlier. This was a hugely influential book for me, and also was very useful for thinking about how to read how to read different spaces like aquariums, where the ocean emerges as a kind of science fictional or alien space. So whereas Stefan Helmrich's question here is, how have narratives about the ocean represented it as alien? One of the questions I began to think about is, well, what if the ocean is not alien itself, but can alienate our perspective on what we take for granted as normal? So in my book, Wild Blue Media, I think of the ocean as a space of science fictional estrangement, not just because books like these have been written about the ocean in the genre of science fiction, but because what good science fiction does, at least for some theorists, is to call attention to what we take for granted as a normal state of affairs, sensations, a normative environment, all these things, and to subtly estrange that through illustrating different scenarios. So there's been so much fiction here written about the ocean, but I became really interested in the way that the ocean could be science fictional as an environment by sort of presenting conditions that we were not used to thinking about certain concepts in. And so Wild Blue Media ended up looking at media theory, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, in my research journey, another hugely influential place was the Duke University Marine Laboratory in Beaufort, North Carolina. So the center island here, you can see, is the very close to sea level expanse that is this location. And I taught summer school here amongst the scientists for a couple different summers. And I also got certified to scuba dive while I was working here one summer, teaching a class on literature of the ocean. So this environment was really important for me to be sitting at picnic tables talking with ocean scientists about what they were working on, or just whatever comes up during lunchtime, and to join them on field trips as I was actively thinking about my book. This is a selfie from a little bit later off the coast of the Channel Islands, here near Santa Barbara in the unceded but traditional waters and lands of the Chumash people. So this is Santa Cruz Island, what's now called Santa Cruz Island behind me, and this was sort of the start of some serious underwater field work. And I quickly realized that I could write about other people's descriptions of the ocean, but what I really needed was the experience of being in the water myself as a point to reflect on my own habits of observation and habits of orientation. So one thing I talk about in Wild Blue Media is the way that when I first learned how to dive, every time I felt out of control, I wanted to stand up. I had a hard time maintaining kind of the horizontal posture, but I wanted my feet underneath me. And I think that then became the kernel for reflecting on other habits of orientation, not only physically, but also in language. Okay, so Wild Blue Media, thinking through seawater. This is a photo on the cover that I took myself a couple miles away here in the ocean at the end of a dive when I was floating one day. And this book thinks about a methodology of conceptual displacement. So what happens to our expectations of a concept if we think about it and how it operates in an oceanic environment instead of a terrestrial one? This may seem a little binary because it's also, of course, very particular which ocean environment. Are we talking about somewhere near the surface? Are we talking about somewhere in the wide open ocean, or are we talking about somewhere in the abyss? And then what are the geopolitics of that particular ocean one might imagine submerging that concept in? Those things all matter. But the idea was just to throw out the thought experiment: what happens when you submerge concepts underwater? And the four that I work with in Wild Blue Media are interfaces, databases, inscriptions, and also museums. So the end of the book on underwater museums looks a little bit at artist Jason DeCaires-Taylor's underwater sculptures and my own visitations to them, and then reflects back on the other three concepts. And throughout the book, I also think a lot about what I call terrestrial bias. So to what extent do we draw on a terrestrial bias in our descriptions, in our conceptualizations, in all kinds of different practices? One that surprised me recently as a kind of adaptation of my work was thinking about the terrestrial biases of the law in legal context, such as the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which Susan Reed recently wrote a brilliant dissertation on, thinking where can we read for elements of terrestrial bias in legal conceptions of the ocean itself, and how do those exhibit harm? So I was really happy to see that. But the book itself does these two things: conceptual displacement, looks for areas of terrestrial bias, and then develops a theory of what I call milieu specificity to address the ways that thought always presses up against particular environments. So while I've written this book about the ocean as a space, milieu-specific analysis names a kind of general and expansive attention to the particularities of any environment we might interact with or think through in a way. So one could carry milieu-specific analysis to outer space, to high elevation mountains, to delta environments, to glacial environments. I think it would be wonderful to see these proliferate in all kinds of directions. So one important element to thinking milieu specifically has to do with both the body and environment, and particularly orientation. So some of the fiction I talk about in a wide archive that spans science fiction, digital media, nonfiction, diving narratives, and many other things. I choose examples that play with orientation in certain ways. So maybe some of you have seen the film by Denis Villeneuve called Arrival that came out not too long ago, based on the science fiction story, The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. And this story was really influential for me as I was thinking about the importance of orientation and language. And if you think about it, a lot of work in the ocean humanities has focused on nouns and verbs. So for example, fluidity, or things that flow as opposed to objects, or what kind of oceanic vocabulary could we develop for describing things that's different from a terrestrial one at the level of concepts. So that's a lot of nouns and verbs. But what I look at are also prepositions, because prepositions like up, down, left, right, these are all types of, a kind of grammatical element of speech that indicates relationships in space or time, how one orients. And in Chang's Story of Your Life, there's sort of this wonderful moment where the linguist, Louise Banks, realizes that the inky writing of these heptapods has to be understood as a reflection of their own radial symmetry. So just like a starfish is radial, these alien creatures have developed a system of writing that could be rotated or read different ways because they themselves would sort of carry that through. And so the movie interprets this in a particular way, but it connects to several other things I was trying to talk about in Wild Blue Media. One of those is the commentary on Willem Flusser's speculative text about the imaginary world of the vampire squid. And this is a tough nut to crack. It's a really, I think, wonderfully imaginative and challenging text that can be read on multiple levels. One of those is purely as a sort of speculative fiction, or what Flusser calls fictional science narrative about the imaginary world of the vampire squid, how its conditions of living in an abyssal environment with a completely different body plan would give rise to very different philosophical orientations about its world if we sort of grant it this that capacity. So Flusser asks questions like, what kinds of media would exist for the vampire squid in the abyss? But another level I think one could read it at is as an allegory about photography, where the vampire squid is sort of both the camera and photographer. And if you do a passage by passage analysis, it's actually very similar to Flusser's writings on photography. But what became important for me were the ways that Flusser also thought about the orientations of the vampire squid in the abyss and how these would be very, very different from us. So whereas our posture, he describes as being like a coat hanger with bilateral symmetry, we're kind of upright, the vampire squid is floating, and it's also radially sort of symmetric, or close enough with its many tentacles. So I think he models a really great way of asking the speculative question: how do different kinds of body plans in relation to different environments, like the floating environment of the abyss, potentially give rise to very different ways of conceptualizing, thinking about the world, orienting, and the like. So I tried to bring orientation to bear on some of the ways that I began to read and interpret different kinds of visual media, including photography and sculpture. So Jason DeCaires-Taylor's work in his underwater sculptures is probably very well known to, many of you. But I went to visit the installation called Silent Evolution in 2014. So these sculptures are off the coast of Cancun, and can be visited by tourists either by snorkeling or scuba diving. And so as a scuba diver, I try to pay attention to what was I noticing about these sculptures that was different than their visual representations on Taylor's website, or the Terrestrial Museum counterpart, or in Google Ocean, which simulates a sort of three-dimensional dive or walk through the sculptures underwater. And I think I have this as my next slide, but I'll show you in a minute. Google has a street view mode in the ocean that I became very curious about, because it transposes the metaphor of the street into the ocean, which of course is not very street-like, and movements possible in 3 dimensions, not just 2. So part of what I do in my book is think about what kinds of terrestrial bias are built into the media that we're sort of trained to think of as immersive or representative of the ocean in certain ways, and instead ask, what qualities of the ocean are they representing or not representing? And for me, there are 2 things not represented here. One is pressure. So as a diver, it's really important to pay attention to what pressure you're existing at. Is it just sort of 1 or 2 atmospheres in the relatively shallow water, or is it really deep? Most media representations of the ocean they don't have to go there, so they don't. The other element is ocean chemistry. So chemistry and temperature, these are things that are really important for all the life forms that live here, especially the corals. As we know now, corals are under threat due to rising ocean temperatures as a consequence of anthropogenic climate change. And so what you don't see in just the street view image is the warming ocean, and you don't see the slow acidification of the ocean either. These things are not sort of tangible without narrative indication. So as I was observing these sculptures in person, there was a current that kept sweeping me along, whereas the photographs on Taylor's own site all employed an aesthetic of frontality as a kind of almost human portraiture. It was really hard to get those points of view in person. I was thrown all around by the water. So what was much easier to do was to float above the sculptures like this, and to hover. And I also noticed that many of them had different growths than in Taylor's very, very well curated website. So what this told me, though, was that the underwater photographs of the sculptures were emulating a terrestrial aesthetic rather than all these other things one could pay attention to in the environment of observation. So since some of my background is in science and technology studies, and specifically feminist science and technology studies, I thought a lot about the quality of situated knowledge here. So following Donna Haraway, what are the conditions under which observation can happen at all, and what kind of qualified objectivity can kind of emerge from that? Okay. Now, diving in person has a lot of other benefits as well. I think there's a whole tactility and also, a tactility and sensuousness about being underwater. And Jacques Cousteau described this really well in his memoir, The Silent World, when he talks about the phenomenology of diving. So he writes, "From this day forward, we would swim across miles of country no man had known, free and level, flesh feeling what the fish scales know." And I love this last line about flesh feeling what the fish scales know, as a kind of approximation, but also a kind of impossibility. Fish scales are so sensitive to fluctuations in water pressure and vibration that they're picking up more than we are. Fish have something called a lateral line, but it's still an invitation to pay attention to what kind of sensuous knowledge is possible through physically immersing oneself underwater. So I applied for different grants to pursue more scuba diving that made the case for why one has to do this in person, which is that the phenomenological qualities of sensation underwater are best observed in person, not just through other people's accounts. Although it turns out that Cousteau's memoir and also the memoir that Sylvia Earle wrote, Sea Change, A Message of the Oceans, are both fantastic sort of archives or repositories for reflecting on what it's like to sense underwater. And I found that their written narratives did this better than documentaries, because documentaries and film want to show you the ocean, but they don't always tell you what it feels like. So you sort of have to turn to this material to get a better sense of that. And I actually really love Sylvia Earle's activism and her writing. And one thing she said often, but also is quoted by someone else here, is a very different sort of conception of what an interface is than we normally see in media theory. So I'll just read this quote out loud by Christina Gerda. "Often referred to as the blue heart of the planet, the global ocean is vital for maintaining life as we know it on Earth. I prefer to call it the blue lungs of the planet, for ocean phytoplankton supply 50% or more of the oxygen that we breathe." So I thought this was a stunning analogy to think of the ocean as a kind of lung of the planet, especially when, as a scuba diver, the lungs are so important and you're carrying this heavy tank of extra air on your back, a kind of prosthetic lung to supplement your existing lungs. So there's something about the homology between these two, and the way that an interface can be thought in a much more feminist post-humanist sense as a porous boundary, rather than as kind of the firm, glassy lens of the webcam, of the computer screen, even if it's a touch screen, it's not quite the same porosity or risk as physically going in person and experiencing the saturation of tissues with this extra gas. Okay, so towards the end of my book, I also got interested in other kinds of political submersions, and I wrote an article based on the book, but afterwards on diving as a kind of performative science fiction. This underwater cabinet meeting in the Maldives has been discussed by many other environmental humanities scholars, among them Elizabeth DeLowry and Rob Nixon. But I also think it's just a wonderful science fictional example of trying to perform a post-Diluvian or post-climate change future here, which is the Maldives underwater, in order to try to prevent it from happening. So here the cabinet is signing on to a commitment to become carbon neutral by a certain date. So I thought that this example models some of the ways that one could think about literal submergence in a science fictional sense and take that in a variety of directions. I want to transition now to talking about some of the things I've been working on after Wild Blue Media that continue an interest in oceans and diving as an eco tactic for knowing and also for estranging, for sort of maybe destabilizing or making us aware of what we take for granted as very terrestrial human beings. So I recently wrote an essay called Groundedness Through Floating that reflects on Hope Ginsberg's project Meditation Ocean, where she gathered divers to sit and meditate underwater for extended periods of time. I've only included one image here, but there's another one that looks really quite amazing, where the divers, instead of sitting cross-legged, they would kneel on the seafloor, and it emulated very closely the organism of seagrass, sort of blade like this, that was very close to the divers. So I was joking with her that this is a seagrass asana if you needed to sort of give it a yoga pose name. But I was playing with what groundedness means when we assume that it is about stability, about truth, grounded truth. Legal grounds or legal standing also draw on a sort of terrestrial metaphoricity. So I played around with what groundedness through floating might mean, trying to disarticulate literal ground from the abstraction of groundedness, which could be found in other postures, other floating postures. I was also thinking about language a lot with this piece called Fluid Cuts, the Anti-Visual Logic of Surfactants after Deepwater Horizons. So if the cut has been understood as a slice, what happens when that which cuts is actually a liquid surfactant, a soap of sorts that's supposed to cut through oil? And another experimentation with language was the edited collection Saturation and Elemental Politics, where I wrote a short piece on seaweeds. And I co-edited this with Rafiko Ruiz. And our idea here was to think about saturation as a different heuristic, a different material heuristic than entanglement. Not exclusive of entanglement, but let's call it a proliferation or supplement or something else. And so what happens when you start with, instead of maybe following the recent eco-critical trend of picking a substance and then seeing where it goes, what happens if you start out with conditions of saturation rather than starting out with, I'm going to think about salt, or I'm going to think about water. What kinds of other materiality are in that initial maybe site that one starts thinking about? I've also been thinking about seaweeds as photo media that have a kind of analogy to photographic film. And Bernard Siegert recently reminded me that even the study of photosynthesis itself used elements of camera technologies, sort of photometer. So there's this interesting parallel between how seaweeds and also plants are photosensitive, and also how camera film itself is photosensitive. And so this led to some work around cyanotypes, and then this piece on photomosaics and the scientific mapping of seaweeds. I'm working on a new, co-editing a new essay collection now called Holding Sway, Seaweeds and the Politics of Form. I think I'm a little short on time, so I might not talk about this one as much, but seaweeds are so wonderfully tactile that I wanted to explore some of the ways they've been thought of as media, as forms. Seaweeds are in everything from petri dishes to beauty products to your ice cream that you eat as a stabilizer. They're to be found in many places. And let's see, I think I'll maybe skip this one and just end on.
We are good with time, Melody. Don't worry.
Oh, we're good on time? Okay.
Yeah, just tell your story. Take your time.
All right, I'll go back here. Okay, so again, like kind of evolving out out of the book, I've done some coastal diving here in Santa Barbara, and I came across with a friend this one site, which is the image on the right, that I heard some folks colloquially calling a bookshelf reef. And so this, of course, grabbed my attention as a potential underwater displacement. So I wrote a piece thinking about what changes when one imagines a bookshelf, not on land, but underwater, what's important here. And it turns out that gravity is actually, a very, very important factor, the fact that things could sort of float away. And then in addition, I've tried to get myself in situations to hang out with different scientists, different ocean scientists. So here are a few photographs from this cruise on the RV Sally Ride, which is one of the ships managed by UC San Diego. So here you see a couple different scientists that I was at work with, and some of their sampling. And this helped me actually to really think about a lot of the handwork that goes into scientific creation of knowledge on these boats. One of the verbs that this reference is probably not going to hit for a lot of people, but there was a TV show in the 80s and 90s called MacGyver, and it was thrown around as a verb a lot on the ship, like, okay, we're going to go MacGyver that core sampler because it needs an extra wooden sort of frame or shoe so it doesn't sink into the mud and like pull the ship down. So so there was a lot of you can see on the image sort of to the upper right, like power tools were involved and things were happening kind of at the last minute. So there's something really important, I think, in oceanography itself that has to do with the power of sampling and then organizing those samples into a bigger picture, into a mosaic, one might say. And then the last project I want to describe is a collaboration funded through the Ocean Memory Project that we've been calling Invisible Kelp Forest from Smell to Sound. And this is a collaboration with Anya Yermakova, Jacob Cram, and Eli Stein. And the idea here is maybe closer to fiction writing than I've come so far in my career as an academic. Usually I write about other people's work, but don't dabble myself. But the idea here was, what if we translated the smell of a kelp forest into sound? In what ways are smell and sound similar dispersive media that require some kind of three-dimensional sensing, or that one can tell how near or far one is based on proximity, and both have a similar, I think, kind of relation to haunting, but also presence. So we were, curious about these things, and also very inspired by the wonderful book by Ed Yong called An Immense World. A brief note on Ed Yong: he's a science writer for The Atlantic, and he does both important, he's been doing amazing work covering COVID-19, but at the same time found space for sort of a passion project about the sensory worlds of animals and how one might intuit these. So in thinking about this Invisible Kelp Forest project, we ended up choosing 4 different organisms in the kelp forest: porcelain crabs, brittle stars, microbes, and then the giant kelp themselves, to think about how they were sensing through elements of synesthesia. How could we narrate these, and what might a sonic translation rather than sonification, which we didn't want to do, how might a translation sort of work? And part of our field work for this was snorkeling. So in order to understand how water moves, our scientist, Jacob, brought along some fluorescent dye. And so you can see him in the upper right-hand corner here, releasing a syringe of this super fluorescent dye that then dispersed differently. It dispersed differently in the water, and then also in a very kelpy area of where we were snorkeling. So when there was no kelp, it kind of vanished more quickly, but in the stiller water of the kelp forest, it more slowly expanded into this almost sort of abstract, feathery dancer skirt, swirling, hyperbolic kind of form, which I've taken a still image of down here. And doing this helped us to understand how smell might be connected to water movement. If we wanted to see if we could then translate this into some kind of sonic form. So unfortunately, the project has not gotten to the sonic translation yet. We've just finished up the written part. And I can read a paragraph about this for you here. So this is a small excerpt from the section about brittle stars. And as a setup, I should say, we did an experiment with the brittle stars. Apparently, they love squid juice. So we poured squid juice into the tank that was above them so that it would eventually flow into their tank. And we just wanted to see what would happen. And it turns out they got very excited, but they didn't chase the smell. They kind of stayed in place, and I'll describe what happened. Imagine the act of smelling as a kind of shiver that runs down your arms and legs, a rolling prickle, preparing your whole body to become available for action. On a chemical level, the squid juice activates the receptors on your skin, your muscles, your fascia. It is a full body response. Observers might call your movements a dance, but what emerges is not choreographed. You aren't thinking about intricate patterns that are beautiful to watch or an ordered sequence of movements. Your unchoreographed dance is more an improvised response to smell sensing, and you swirl your appendages to concentrate this sensation more fully. The creation of motion or turbulence is a strategy to draw the smell and maybe tasty particles closer to your grasping tube feet. You move not to chase down prey, or locomote, but to waft tasty particles closer to you. In this dance, you do not worry about where the smell is coming from, like a detective. Instead, your logicking is source agnostic, much like contact improvisation dance, whose nickname armpit dance is appropriate here. You unfurl your arms in constant contact with the water. The axis of olfaction is not a center or nose, but your 5 appendages rotating through space. Smell is imminence. Okay, and we're going to see what our collaborator Eli does to try to translate this into sound. So that's all I've prepared as a kind of story about my own research journey, and I hope you've been able to learn a little bit about how I'm thinking of diving as an eco-tactic or snorkeling as an eco-tactic, a way of getting to know place, but also a way of surprising yourself through different kinds of either physical or imaginative displacements. All right, I think maybe that's a good time to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Melody. That was extremely rich, and I just came back home from another ocean, from actually diving for the first time with giant coral reefs, which was kind of life-changing and very animistic. So your journey really kind of opened different senses and reconnected with some shared references we also have of different authors that have been exploring and experimenting with the oceanic imaginaries and these kind of frontiers of what is this alien planet that is so kind of familiar to us, but also so distant that we will never sense in the same way as amphibian or fish or other kind of creatures that navigate between dimensions we don't go fully. So I really enjoyed in your presentation how you kind of you navigate the space between the body, an idea of interface which is, I think, expanding or dissolve, because it's an interface which can be ocean media, the whole ocean as a media. And how you can also style some of these kind of fields as spaces for love, for the terrestrial bias. So we have senses of orientation and disorientation in your kind of conceptualization or reconceptualization of the interface and the sensory. So I just kind of have mind maps and references, things to dive further. I was kind of very excited on your presentation on the later project on this kind of sensuous narrative writing, because I've been writing a lot about ocean sensing myself, even if I haven't shared all the books. So I'm very curious to see how the sound is expanding another dimension here. Is sound as well reacts so differently on water than on air. So we also have many different ways of diving into these dimensions of the sensory, which are always so species specific. No, there's as you said, maybe something that I'm interested is on the idea of experimentation and expertise, because there's something which is so beautiful in the quest for the empirical, no, and the openness to doubt. You know, we as researchers, you know, come to the field with a curiosity, or sometimes with a limit, you know, such as the limit of having gravity or not having it. You know, so this idea of how to expand the limits of research. I was very interested how you explore it through the embodied and the sensory. I don't know if you just want to riff off some of this.
I love your comments, and I'm happy to say a little bit more. First off, maybe going back to something you said earlier about the sound connections. One thing that's been exciting for me is how difficult it is to isolate sound away from other sensations when you turn to ocean organisms, especially sound and touch, or sound and other qualities. But I think those two particularly. And so to even have a language for describing that requires on our part some kind of exercise of synesthesia, or the combining of two senses. So in a lot of my both ocean memory collaborations and then own work have been very curious about how to narrate synesthesia, but then also how not to make the mistake as a theorist of isolating what we take as the five senses away from their other the other ways that they might be embodied in what we would see in combination with something else, but that for those organisms that experience the world that way, we're never separate to begin with. So that's something I was thinking about with sound. But I also really appreciate your question about openness and about expertise. And I should say that I didn't learn how to dive until I was in my mid-20s. I did not grow up doing this, even though swimming was something that had been part of my life, not competitively, just for fun. So there was something about starting out as a beginner that is just such a valuable time to notice. You notice different things when something is hard for you. So that helped. I think that was, just really key for me in order to theorize about diving, to have it be something that I had to learn my way into. But the other way I think about expertise is actually just, through all this close attention to sensation and multi-species phenomenology, ideally, it should make you a little bit more humble about your place in the world, knowing that you too are very specifically attuned, and that there's all these other sensory umwelt out there. There's been a tendency, I think, to try to give that a so what kind of spin, and you can see that even in Ed Yong's writing at the end of Immense World, where he talks about endangered sensory worlds. So if different environments and species are under threat, then also their ways or modes of sensing are similarly at risk. So I saw him, sort of try to make that turn. So something I struggle a little, I think, with in this writing is where the political can kind of come in. Does it happen in moment after writing, or are these is a curiosity about sensation kind of open in itself, that doesn't have to be ascribed like a kind of direction for or application for something later. But yeah, really, I think the ocean, both when you're on it and even when you're thinking about it engenders a kind of humility on the part of the scholar. So not just that there's too much, but just you see yourself a little bit differently in relation to it.
Yeah, and we also kind of acknowledge our space as I always think of the kind of the metaphor of the astronauts, no, and how much we know about space or the deep ocean, and it's probably a place almost all of us will never visit, the deep ocean, and it's the single largest existing ecosystem on the planet. So how do we live with this familiar distance or unfamiliar intimacy with this kind of abyss that is so fantastic and extremely understudied but already polluted? So how do we as humans feel chemically entangled in this process in the saturation of our choices in our to take your metaphor of saturation, which I really really enjoyed here, and how much we owe to this kind of these imaginaries, but they are political in decision making of the everyday, even if we're not in the ocean. We are deeply connected. I don't know, as we were speaking about sensuous knowledge and interfaces, I was also thinking, of course, of James Doran Peters or James Nestor, that I really like and write about. And Nestor is, a freediver himself, and he speaks about the relation with the forgotten senses, which is something that I really love. Even the magnetites that some animals feel, the electroperception, like sharks or manta rays, and we still know very little about their navigation system, and they follow the ley lines, so they have a very beautiful navigation kind of system and performance. Even actually thinking on the parallels with the strangeness of the imaginary roads of this Google Ocean and how other senses are navigating their own cartographies, imaginary cartographies, or how we reproduce them in our understanding. But they just came up as very interesting references here. But I actually wanted to share a question that some people are, watching us. And we have Ritika Biswas, who's writing, and she said, "Thank you, Melody, for that porous talk. I'm curious about how you navigate the human and non-human geopolitics of these liquid spaces. What are the loci, the boundaries, transversalities you encounter?"
Oh, that's a nice open question. So, I take a lot of influence from the work of a lot of human geographers like Philip Steinberg and Kimberly Peters to think about the ways that the ocean is not an other space that's not, a place apart, but that has always been crossed by human activity. And if you look at a different, literary and cultural archive that expands across the world, there's of course so much to look at in anyone who's sailed or dove under the oceans. This is not restricted to a particular time or place. I guess I can talk about some of the seaweed work that is upcoming. And also in terms of boundaries, let's see, maybe I'll talk about this one first. If you look at the ways that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea conceptualizes the ocean, it has nothing to do with how the ocean actually works. There's, for tuna management, just for example, and I'm taking this from Jen Teleska's amazing book, Red Gold. It imagines the Atlantic as having a western stalk and an eastern stalk with a line drawn down the middle, as if the tuna never migrate. And then it proportions amounts that are extractable of these tuna based on that misconceptualization. And that in itself does a great amount of harm to the bluefin tuna, and is one among many, one could choose many other examples of that have a kind of global geopolitical resonance where intentionally misunderstanding the materiality of the ocean has consequences for species extinction, and also the way that human communities fish and feed each other and their encounters with different kinds of extractivism. So that incident, always stuck with me as a particular instance of where yeah, again, misconceptualizing the materiality of the ocean has implications that kind of resonate beyond. I was at a summer school also, or giving a summer class this year with forensic oceanography, and I think their work is paradigmatic in thinking about the importance of the ocean's materiality and borders, and how one can mobilize tools of spatial mapping towards establishing better accounts of what kinds of violence at sea happened, and the way that inaction is often is lethal as other things. So I think they're doing amazing work. Let's see, I think I'm maybe forgetting the second half of the question here, but but there's all kinds of ways one can take this, and I think just another is that if you hang out with scientists enough, that there's maybe some qualities of the ocean pop that catch your attention in ways you may not have thought of, like oceanographers who think of the ocean's movements in the inside as a matter of sculpture, like water as a sculptural medium, not for how it sculpts land, but for how there may be currents, thermoclines, haloclines, other meaningful borders within the water column. So it's been important to me to look at the different human cultural elements, but then also not just limit those to ships and movements of the surface, but to look at who's paying attention to qualities that are submerged and underwater. And that in itself has been a whole source of imagination in African futurism, Afrofuturism, where different stories about life that persists underwater exist. Thinking of Nnedi Okorafor, Drexciya, and others that sort of play with this other imaginary of what surprises us about the persistence of life underwater, even under other circumstances. So this is a maybe rambling answer just to say that the influences are vast for how one thinks borders and ocean geopolitics.
Yeah, you mentioned Drexciya, and we have for sure many fans of Drexciya watching this either now or later on, because Generation programs lots of music, and many of us are indebted to the hydrofictions of Drexciya, which have been, with us for the last 20 years. There's something interesting in some examples that you picked up, which is on the condition of liminality, not only of the seabed, but also like the space between the dead, the undead, organic matter, inorganic matter, that Elizabeth Povinelli also speaks on this kind of the equation of biopolitics that you find here. But I guess my thoughts is following your answers and your sharing today as well, and this question around law. I was just today writing a little bit about it and thinking, how can we as like researchers and media theorists counter this imaginary of partition, that law is still making, in dividing. We are on, of course, a post-colonial, still imperial kind of regime, but where the ocean is being divided in the same way as the pink map did, hundreds of years ago. So the imaginaries of divides are still so present. And the way how we relate to ecosystems or even single species sometimes still comes from this, these spaces of divide. So what can we do to counter this?
Ooh.
We don't have to solve the problems of the world now, but it's something that is on my mind over the last years, and that kind of motivates me further in the activism and in the writing.
I think one thing that is possible is as a kind of pre-activist mode. So in my book, I talk about the way that ocean art, media, description theory can have a pre-activist mode before directional politics. So whereas the underwater cabinet meeting had a very direct political aim of arguing for survivability of oceanic nations in face of global warming and sea level rise, others can do a little bit of different work. So one thing I think we might always ask the question, what are our habits of description, and where is it possible to either create or look for elements of surprise. And if we take, for example, the case of the deep sea, the site of so much extraction, oil extraction, deep sea mineral extraction, hydrothermal vent systems, there do occur patterns of description for these spaces that have to do with the Gothic, that have to do with ocean origins, that have to do with the prehistoric, that have to do with the alien. So some of the critical work I think one can do is to try to shake these up, try something different, experiment with genre as a lens, or to experiment with the way these are portrayed, and to make sure the human is part of these pictures. I think some of the reason, at least for me, that Drexia is so captivating has to do with what Candace Fujikane would call ecologies of abundance, or finding life in human life thriving in places that may not have been expected, and thinking of those strategically in ways that counter capitalism or extractive tendencies, or could be sort of mobilized in that way. I think that there's a lot of need for new stories about the deep sea, whether this is encountering the deep sea as one might in Hawaii as a space of the ancestors, or the deep sea as harboring familiar organisms, not alien organisms, or I'm not sure, actually I don't have an answer to what the opposite of the Gothic is, but how different stories can be told about places that are currently being zoned for different kinds of extractivism. Something that a friend of mine, Mandy Joy, who did a lot of work on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, said, reflecting on her times being one of the rare people who goes down in a submarine, is that there are tons and tons of colors when you arrive at a hydrothermal vent. For her, these are more intense than even coral reefs sometimes when you're showing the lights. So to think of a hydrothermal vent as this kind of rainbow space was surprising to me. But then she added another level to that, which is to reflect on, well, where did these colors come from? They're coming from minerals. So she sort of arrived at this place of thinking of life as mineral, that for me immediately set off bells of connection with works like Catherine Yusof's A Billion Black Anthropocenes, or Elizabeth Pavanelli's geontologies, thinking about human life as mineral. And it's just such a poetic and different way of thinking of, just finding a place to begin. So where is I going with that? So I think, there's just, I think, the challenge would be, how do you tell new stories about the ocean that don't repeat all the kind of tired things that Greenpeace and other organizations, say, like, we don't need another polar bear on an iceberg. And even if we don't work in advertising, we're still working in, economies of images and narratives. So what's the new thing to say? And this has to change over time. This is not something that's static or can stay put. I think I'm sounding maybe a little modernist here, but anyway, that's something I think that we can all contribute to in our work.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I'm quite fascinated by hydrothermal vents myself. I do lots of deep sea mining activism since some years. I actually did a short video with Stefan about it. They're all online. And we're trying to protect the hydrothermal vents here in the Azores archipelago, but also, in the Atlantic and elsewhere. We have different networks, which I can also share the links later for those watching that want to join the deep sea mining campaigns. But it's something that we speak about. Some of my friends also doing media studies, right, is about the idea of different timescales and the perception of these timescales on the geological and biological, because different kind of also science entities, they ask for funding, to different kind of corporations, and they're entangled in different perceptions of what is deep time and what is this chemical continuum. So you would very easily, around these underwater volcanoes, have, biological and geological communities, but also the different scientists fighting because they look at things with different rates of perception. So ideas of also scale and orientation, I think, are present on these ecosystems, and how we even develop the lexicon to talk about it in the lens of perception of where is life starting and ending, or the critters, or, as Stefan also wrote, they have lateral gene transfer, so they have way more complicated ways of existence and of bacterial exchange that, that also make revolutions of how we understand living creatures on Earth if we look deep in the ocean. But yeah, I think we had a very beautiful conversation that seems like could flourish in more questions and more conversation. I'm thankful for the audience and those that were here, and it will be recorded online as a data bank of all these eco-tactics and sharing the research path of our guests. So Melody, I want to thank you for joining us today, and hoping we can stay in touch and you can join us on a future session, and wishing you a great day in Santa Barbara.
Great, thank you.
It was great to host you. Thank you, Generation, and all the team, and see you soon again. Bye.
Bye.